Hi there, and welcome once again to the Explaining History podcast. And in this episode, I want to talk about the reasoning, particularly in the United States of America during the First World War, about what to do regarding the colonies, soon to become former colonies, of the Central Powers, particularly Germany and the Ottoman Empire. The discussions that are had and the events that occur during the war, particularly as the war is fought in Africa and the Middle East, shape the development of mandates, which would be the new form of kind of neo-colonialism that would emerge at the end of the First World War. I've recently been reading The Guardians by Susan Pedersen. It's a history of the mandate system and the League of Nations, and really the decline of 19th century empire as a new world where American power and the development of the League of Nations creates all sorts of tensions which couldn't be reconciled in the way in which they had been in the 19th century through various congresses and conferences between European powers. When Woodrow Wilson had made his 14 points, they didn't really pertain very closely to the world as it actually existed. Some of them were very grandiose ambitions, which were very difficult to reconcile with reality. Woodrow Wilson, on the journey from America to Europe to attend the Paris Peace Conference, is an extremely remote figure, spending a lot of time in his stateroom, not socialising or interacting very much with the rest of his delegation, a 100-strong group, and it was on this journey that a lot of policy was formulated, and many of the delegation were desperate for Wilson to come out and clarify specifically what he meant. For example, the fifth point was that the League of Nations hopefully settle free, open-minded and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. That, in its wording, can mean all sorts of things. But implicit was the fact that annexation, simply giving colonies now and territories to the victorious powers as rewards for their fighting, the spoils of war, which had really been a practice from time immemorial, this had been ruled out. And instead, some of the peoples who had been colonized by Germany, by the Ottoman Empire, would now go into some kind of stewardship. There would be, particularly in Africa and the Pacific, the prevailing racist views of Africans at that time is that it was impossible they would be able to manage their own affairs. This, to us, to our 20th century liberal ears, is a deeply offensive concept, but we have to remember that we're not talking about the perspectives that we have. We're looking at the perspectives that highly educated and seemingly progressive individuals, people who, for example, were part of Wilson's delegation, hardly the most reactionary leader at the Paris Peace Conference, but still imbued in a white colonial Western paternalist perspective, which the idea that Africans were incapable of running things themselves was a seeming common sense. Wilson said that the colonies would be, he put it, common property of the League of Nations, that the League of Nations would be the proprietor, and that the administration would go down, hopefully, to a non-imperial state. Wilson thought that perhaps Swedes and Norwegians and Danes might be the appropriate people as kind of honest, impartial brokers to manage countries that had been, such as the German Southwest African colony. Returning colonies to their colonial masters was an absolute red line for Wilson, who said, "Nothing could be more ignoble than to turn over millions of helpless natives to the tender mercies of Germany." It's doubtful that Wilson here was referring to Germany's own particular colonial track record, such as the genocide of the Nama and the Herero people in German Southwest Africa in the late 1880s. Instead, he was probably discussing Germany's supposed track record of brutality in its occupation of Belgium and France. Much of this is the stuff of wild exaggeration by Allied propagandists. And I think I did a podcast on this very topic about 3 or 4 weeks ago about British propaganda and the First World War. Not to say that Germany was innocent in the occupation of Belgium, and certainly civilians were killed, but nothing on the scale of what was actually alleged. So if the colonies weren't to be recolonised and they weren't to manage themselves, then the steering body in America, who had looked into all this, which was referred to as the Inquiry, concluded that the Negro race has hitherto shown no capacity for progressive development except under the tutelage of other peoples. Well, a country divided by race, with a history of slavery and the enslavement of African people, would, doubtless have come to this conclusion based on its recent past. The views of the Inquiry were undoubtedly shaped by America's own experience of the enslavement of African people. One of the American delegation, George Louis Beer, questioned whether the smaller nations of Europe, the Norwegians, for example, were really equipped to manage an entire African colony. After all, what experience did they have? And for Beer, there was only one model that was in any way adequate. This was perhaps the least worst option, and that was the British. Beer argued that native rights were most carefully and effectively protected by the British and in British colonies, and that Britain was most aligned in its thinking with America. The real goal of America at the Paris Peace Conference, as I've discussed many times in the podcast, was to establish free trade and free trading policies that would allow the United States to penetrate Africa and Asia. And this would be the thing that would underline the future international order and guarantee peace. Unsurprisingly, the British were already very receptive to this point of view, that mandates should be governed in roughly a way that the British had governed them, and the British were stepping forward at the Paris Peace Conference, led by David Lloyd George, to be the first to embrace these new mandates and to acquire them. If Europe was shaped by the Versailles Settlement, which involved the punishment of Germany and the reordering of the former Habsburg, Romanov and Ottoman empires, this can loosely be thought of as a Europe redefined by French concerns, mainly the concern for French security. The rest of the world seems to have been settled, particularly Africa and the Middle East, by British concerns. British imperial practices were imposed upon the mandates, but also Anglo-American power underwrote the security of these new mandates, and the influence of the United States was key in creating not only the League of Nations but the mandate system. And so when America pulls out of the League of Nations and refuses to ratify the Treaty of Versailles when Wilson returns to the States, it makes the new system highly vulnerable and unstable, and the mandates regime that was created at the Paris Peace Conference by 1920 is almost dead in the water. Instead of being backed up by American power, or the power of a fading British Empire. The mandate system is simply backed up by the moral authority of the League of Nations itself. And obviously, as we can see, throughout the 1920s and 30s, the moral authority of the League of Nations is simply not enough. For the German and Ottoman empires, their colonies had been stripped from them bit by bit throughout the war. And so by 1918, particularly in the case of Germany, the colonial possessions of the Wilhelmine Reich had already been seized, and there was only a faint glimmer of hope amongst the new Weimar Republic that these colonies would be returned. Germany's Pacific colonies were the first to go. In 1914, for example, New Zealand soldiers landed in Samoa, which was undefended, and the New Zealand troops seized the islands without a battle. Nauru, a phosphate-rich island from guano and bird droppings and that kind of thing, was later turned over to Australia when the HMAS Melbourne turned up there on September the 9th, 1914. And New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago, the Bismarck Islands, were quickly seized by the Australian Navy as well. The Australians actually travelled as far as the Caroline, Mariana and Marshall Islands, only to realise that Britain's other ally, Japan, had annexed these and seized them. And in the space of 8 weeks from the beginning of hostilities, the entirety of Germany's Pacific Island possessions had been captured by its enemies. The war in Africa, which resulted in millions of African deaths, and yet is largely ignored in official histories of the First World War that focus on the trenches of the Western Front, saw quick victories to the British and French in the siege of Togoland and the Cameroonian port of Douala, but the fight was a lot longer when the well-equipped German armies in Central Africa and Southwest Africa resisted and fought hard against their enemies. And in the midst of this new war in Africa, curious racial politics of solidarity and, one might say, bigotry emerge, where white, British, South African and German troops refused to fire on one another, arguing that there was something deeply dishonourable in shooting at a white man. Now, these were colonial troops who'd been used to fight colonial wars. The idea that there was some kind of solidarity amongst Europeans against the oppressed Africans who they governed was an article of faith, and it emerges in 1915. And the struggle against German Southwest Africa and German East Africa was a long, protracted, drawn-out and bloody conflict that killed most Africans through famine. It presented the Belgians in Africa with an opportunity to seize Rwanda and Burundi from Germany, and the historical consequences and legacy of the policy that the Belgians introduced into Rwanda could be felt at the end of the 20th century in the Rwandan genocide, but that's definitely a story for another time. While the war was still on, colonialism continued in Africa. South Africa, the British Imperial Dominion of South Africa, began to extend its railway lines northwards and take new territories which were handed out to white settlers. Australia, in the territory of New Guinea, doubled the number of indentured labourers on plantations that had been seized, indentured labour being little better than slavery by and large. And there was a great debate at the heart of British government policy towards newly captured territories. There were some members of the General Staff who said, if you deprive Germany of all of her colonies, you will have a resentful Germany that will be difficult to deal with after the conclusion of the peace. However, most of these objections were ignored, and the growth of imperial holdings, particularly in German Africa, to provide rewards for British sacrifice during the war, and to protect British dominions from other territories, or to be given out as bribes to allies, was an immense lure. It was seen as almost kind of unthinkable that leaving off the table these acquisitions could be entertained at all. France and Belgium occupied in part, well, France occupied in part and Belgium occupied nearly in its totality by the Germans, were also of the same view, and the French and Belgian population were fixated mainly by events on the Western Front. But at the time, in 1916 and 1970, French officials and Belgian officials were engaged in conversations with the British about what would happen with German colonies. The British, if anything, were more fixated on the Middle East. They had far more troops there than the French, and that meant that they were far more likely to be able to determine the outcome of the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, at the Treaty of London, which was a secret treaty that brought Italy into the war, the offer of parts of the Ottoman Empire, if the war was won, was enough to tilt the balance and to draw Italy into the struggle. Italy was also offered parts of Africa as compensation as well. However, the offer of rewards to Italy depended on how easily Africa and the German holdings in Africa and the Ottoman Empire were conquered anyway. If, as turned out, it was a long, bloody fight in both theatres, and the Italians appeared to have contributed very little, then when one gets to the Paris Peace Conference, simply packaging them up nice gifts that had been earned with an immense amount of British imperial and French imperial blood was politically unpalatable. In Mesopotamia, for example, the British Indian Army had fought there for 4 years and with the loss of nearly 100,000 men. The difficulties that Britain encounters in Mesopotamia and Palestine lead to the necessity of falling back on Arab support. And in 1915, connections are made with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who was the ruler of Hijaz, the Hijaz region, along the western seaboard of the Arabian Peninsula, and promises made to Sharif Hussein by Sir Henry McMahon, the High Commissioner of Egypt, highly misleading promises, and then the efforts of Sharif Hussein's Arab fighters, led in part by Lawrence of Arabia, meant that the carve-up of the Ottoman Empire, and once again the rewarding of Italy, along with France and Britain, becomes far more politically volatile and complex. When France looked at alliances between Britain and the Arabs, they smelt trouble. The French had powerful and long-standing interests in the Levant, the region of which is now Lebanon and Syria. The French in the mid-19th century had been able to guarantee the rights within the Ottoman Empire of the Christian community in Lebanon for the foreseeable future, and French businesses had a huge amount of penetration of Syrian and Lebanese markets, particularly in the silk trade. France had become the lingua franca of the educated classes of Lebanon and Syria, and there were 40,000 children enrolled in French schools in Lebanon. And the hope that the French had was that with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, their control could be extended to all of Syria, and they wanted to hopefully annex Palestine as well, into either a mandate or a protectorate or something of that nature. But the French had not really fought for the Middle East. The Middle East had been fought with mainly British and colonial troops, Australians, Indians, and there were few French among them. And so instead, the French had to rely on diplomatic pressure at the Paris Peace Conference. The people such as Clemenceau made the point to Lloyd George that, well, of course, you had free reign in the Middle East because we were taking most of the punishment at places like Verdun, which is perhaps to ignore Britain's sacrifices on the Western Front, but it was the only card he had to play. In May 1916, an agreement between Sir Mark Sykes of Great Britain and Francois-Georges Picot of France carved up the Ottoman Empire. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was only bore Sykes' name because he was the only man in the British government that appeared to have knowledge of the Middle East, and other Orientalists and Arabists, such as Gertrude Bell, questioned whether that was particularly good knowledge at all. And because this agreement had been created, it meant that France was able to establish such direct or indirect administration or control as they desire in Lebanon and a swathe of territory running from all the way up to Armenia. Mesopotamia, or modern-day Iraq, would fall under British control, and coastal Palestine would be placed under international control, with some sort of independent Arab state existing in the middle, which would be now the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This was far less than Sharif Hussein had been promised. He believed that an Arab state extending from Egypt to Persia and from the borders of Turkey all the way down to the tip of Arabia would be the product of the outcome of the war. And at a time when most British officials thought the chance of an Arab state was laughable anyway, this would have been in 1916, plans were afoot to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Note that the wording of the later Balfour Declaration in late 1917 doesn't say state, it says homeland, showed what commitments the British really had to Arab aspirations. What we can see emerging here is under the mandate system that develops throughout the conference, and we'll look at the actual horse trading that creates the mandates in some future podcasts. But what's emerging here is a kind of a strange chimera creature, colonies that aren't called colonies anymore, that function rather like colonies, that exist under international control, but the reality is they are still essentially run by Britain and France and Britain's imperial dominions. And what this means is that a kind of new colonialism was emerging at the end of the First World War, one with a slightly more acceptable veneer, one which kind of pandered to American views on independence and autonomy, even though those views themselves were decidedly illiberal in certain cases. There were all manner of American diplomats that thought that inferior peoples should exist under stewardship and management for the foreseeable future. So this strange chimera of imperial ideas, liberal notions of nation states and nation building, we would see that continued and developed throughout the 20th century as decolonialism occurred after the Second World War, and the various politics that surround the creation of ideas like the Third World in the post-war era, which are things that I will of course return to. Anyway, I hope you found this useful and not too much of a ramble. and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Do remember to give us a good review on the Explaining History iTunes page, and if you can, check out our Patreon page, and I'll post the link at some point below. All the best, thanks, bye-bye.